in as they arrive. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining today's session. I'm Sean Gibb. I'm the Events and Marketing Manager here at Pro Manchester, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Build Back Better, an inclusive economic recovery in the UK, hosted by Leonard Cheshire and the Pro Manchester Disability, Mental Health and Neurodiversity Committee as part of the Pro Manchester's wider EDI committee. Following today's session, I'll send out a post-event email which will contain any post-event collateral. I know that some of the people that are speaking today will have a few things they want to share with you as well to continue the conversation after this. And I'll also send you a link to our feedback form. So please do give us your feedback. It really is helpful to helping us improve and continue to put on great content for you. Just a couple of points of housekeeping. Please be aware that this session is being recorded. Feel free to use the chat function to ask me any questions, make any comments, observations. And if you could just keep your microphones on mute for the time being, but there may be time to ask questions as we go along. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Gemma Shaw, Head of Community Engagement at Leonard Cheshire.
Hi everybody, yes, I'm Gemma Shaw and I work for Leonard Cheshire, a global charity which supports disabled people to live, learn and earn as independently as they choose. And I'm also a member of the Pro Manchester committees sitting on the EDI and the Skills Committee. So thank you for joining us for a discussion today on Build Back Better and inclusive economic recovery in the UK. I appreciate we only have an hour to explore such a broad topic, but yeah, we'll be discussing the important role businesses can play to address the employment gap, focusing on barriers faced by disabled people, and also explore what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the labour market. We're joined by some excellent speakers who can introduce and inform you on these very topics. We will also have a panel discussion exploring what skills and opportunities do disabled people need to join the labour market. And our aim is that you leave feeling more informed and understand what you can do to help influence positive change. So a little bit about our speakers. We have Stefan Trammell, is a senior disability specialist from the International Labour Organization. He has a breadth of experience from the International Labour Organization, International Disability Alliance, and was actively involved in the negotiation process of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. We also have Gemma Hope, Director of Policy at Leonard Cheshire. Gemma leads the charity's influencing insights and research work. We have Ian Ward-Few, speaker volunteer for Leonard Cheshire. Ian sits on our speaker network, delivering talks on different platforms to raise awareness on disability equality. And as a disabled job speaker, Ian has mixed experiences which he's faced and we'll talk about later on in the event. We also have Robin Barayuga, Graduate Accessibility Specialist at the Hut Group. Robin moved back to Manchester after university and took part in the Leonard Cheshire's Change 100 internship scheme for disabled graduates, and now works as a Graduate Accessibility Specialist at the Hut Group. And then we also have Roisin Patton, who is partner at Ward Hadaway. Roisin is an employment law partner with particular expertise in equality law. So to begin the conversation, I would like to hand over to Stefan, who will talk about the impact of COVID-19 on the labour market from a global perspective, with a particular focus on for employment on disabled people. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma, and good morning to everybody. I'm speaking to you from Geneva, headquarters of the International Labour Organization. When the pandemic arrived early last year, in the ILO, the focus of our concern was on the socio-economic impact the pandemic would have. Other organizations, and rightly so, focused on the health impact, which, as we all know, severely impacted on many persons with disabilities worldwide, and also particularly also here in Europe. No? But we focused immediately also on, because we knew there would be an economic crisis, and we were concerned about the impact this would have on persons with disabilities. Now, what is this? What is our situation? The first thing I would say is that unfortunately, we don't have good data that define how the impact, economic impact of the crisis on persons with disability. We have anecdotal evidence, we have some data from some countries, but in general, unfortunately, even when data collection efforts were made by governments, they did not include questions that would allow disaggregation by disability. And that I think is already an important message. Now, we don't yet have an automatic reaction to a crisis situation to make the response disability inclusive. We argued from the ILO immediately, the ILO disability team, which is where I'm heading, that the response plans, this Building Back Better initiative, should include persons with disabilities as a key target group, both with mainstream as well as targeted interventions. I think it's fair to say that if the crisis would have hit us 10 years ago, we would have done even worse, because it's fair to say that the level of attention to persons with disabilities right now by policymakers, by the private sector, and we in the ILO work a lot with the private sector in the framework of our global business and disability network. It's fair to say that the level of attention to persons with disabilities is much higher now than it was before. But it's still, I think the crisis has reminded us that still much more needs to be done, as I said, to really make sure that persons with disabilities are seen as a key target group when situations like this arise. When we discussed within the International Labour Organization last June, we had a high-level meeting with prime ministers, presidents, labor ministers, employers, and trade unions. When we discussed what should be the way out of the crisis. And one of the key words that was mentioned during that meeting was digitalization, a trend that was already there before, but which the pandemic had exponentially increased. It's fair to say that companies that were highly digitalized have done much better during the crisis. And so the trend which was already there has been exponentially increased by the crisis. That led us in 2020 to work on a report that was looking at what do we need to do all together to ensure that people with disabilities are adequately included in the digital economy. A report that we launched early this year and which I would suggest you to read, because it tries to look at the issue. It looks at digital skills, of course, as a key issue, but digital skills that need to lead to digital jobs. Too often do we see vocational training or skills development, yes, that builds some skills, but it does not always lead to jobs. We have a huge opportunity. There was already before the crisis a big unmet demand of IT professionals, cybersecurity, blockchain, artificial intelligence, you name it. If we are able to ensure that a good number of persons with disabilities all over the world have access to these skills and are supported to find jobs, I think we have a huge opportunity there. But it requires our action. Digital accessibility is on the rise, so I'm looking forward to hear from Robin. We organized recently a webinar with companies looking at that. And the main message I got as a non-expert on the issue was 10 years ago, cybersecurity, data privacy were nice to haves. Now they've become must-haves. Digital accessibility is going down the same avenue. And I think that is particularly vital. We also, another issue that is mentioned when people are speaking about the way out of the crisis, this Building Back Better, is climate change. Climate change, the way out of the crisis, the future needs to be much more sustainable from an environmental point of view. And that also brings jobs. It's important for many issues. We know that persons with disabilities are over impacted by climate change, but at the same time, there's also an opportunity there in terms of new jobs that will be created, what we in the ILO call green jobs. And the logic is again the same. We need to ensure that a good share of these jobs go to persons with disabilities. We speak about the new normal. What is the new labor market looking like? Well, the way we see it is there will be many more non-standard forms of employment, fortunately or unfortunately, but it's just a reality. We will need to rethink social protection, which also is right now, it has not always been delivering well for persons with disabilities, so perhaps we have an opportunity there to be part of those discussions and to go for a social protection system that is more supportive, also for persons coming in and out of the labor market, perhaps, because that might be more frequent in the future. Telework whether we like it or not, will be much more with us. You might remember, those of you who have been in this field for many years, for some time telework was seen as the magical solution for the employment of persons with disabilities. It is not. Many people cannot do their work through telework, but many can do. What we now need to see is that in this telework, that will be much more a norm in the future, when we see the news from companies coming in that are rethinking that. And it's a win-win situation if well done, both for companies and employees. But we need to look at it. What are the elements of telework? There are challenges and opportunities. We need to address some of the challenges. It's not just the technical, it's not just the accessibility, it's also other issues that come with telework. We need to increase our knowledge on the impact it has and the opportunities it brings for persons with disabilities. I can say a few more things, but I might say them a bit late. So back to you, Gemma. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you, Stefan. You mentioned a report that you recommend we read. Could you possibly share that link, and then we could share it more widely with the audience today? So that would be really helpful. But thank you. I'm going to hand over to Gemma Hope, who is going to talk about how we build back better, influencing an inclusive economic recovery in the UK. Gemma.
Sorry, there's always one with an issue with mute, and despite trying to do this in advance and to smooth out the technical issues, I've managed to cause a technical issue, so apologies about that. So thank you very much, Gemma. I'm Director of Policy at Leonard Cheshire. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about some of our research about what's been happening in the UK to disabled people's employment during the pandemic. But before we go into that, I just want to talk about what happened before the pandemic. I think I just really want to emphasise that everything wasn't all rosy pre-pandemic. The disability employment gap between disabled and non-disabled people has been around 30% now for well over a decade, although some progress is slowly being made. So I think it was around 28% just before the pandemic hit. It's been painfully slow. And why is that? Well, that's because disabled people tell us there's a number of barriers which make finding and maintaining work difficult for them. There's issues around accessibility of public transport and how people get to work, not having in place the right social care support to enable them to get up and get out in the morning for work. There's issues, I think Stefan just said, about flexible working and home working, about disabled people for whom that is an option, being told that they couldn't do it. And for other people, we'll come onto some issues around employer prejudice in a bit, but there's issues around employer prejudice and they're not necessarily having the right adjustments at work. So all of this was going on before the pandemic and has continued during the pandemic. But then speaking to our employment advisors, so Leonard Cheshire runs a number of different employment programs for people of all ages. Our advisors working in those programs have told us that during the pandemic, there's been particular issues with disabled people who may have been high risk to COVID, being denied furlough or being told they couldn't work at home, which led to some people choosing to exit their jobs and exit the labour market because they were not offered the protections available. And I think, as Stefan says, flexible working has been brilliant for many disabled people, but not every job can be done at home. So not everybody's been offered those flexibilities. There's been issues as well with competition for jobs, and this particularly affects some of the younger people we work with. Our advisor told us about one entry-level administrative job where prior to the pandemic you need no experience for, and then suddenly the criteria for that role was asking for 8 years of experience. So that excludes anybody with no recent work history or people trying to get a foot in the door in the labour market. So the bar has been raised a lot higher for disabled people trying to find work because of the pandemic. I think another problem has been, and this comes into this employer attitudes point as well, we've been told that, particularly for some of the younger disabled people we work with, that employers didn't want to take them on board because they couldn't do CSR this year because the pandemic's, squeezing bottom lines. And I think we understand pressures, of course, on people's businesses, but employing disabled people is not an of charity. You know, we're offering talented people to fill jobs, and I think that point around misconceptions has sort of been entrenched by the pandemic. So as Stefan also said, we have the labour force survey here in the UK, which now has very up-to-date statistics a year, 18 months later, on what's happened to disabled people in the labour market. And it does show that they've been disproportionately impacted. But when we did this research in September last year, there was no data. So we commissioned Savanta, a polling agency, to poll over 1,000 disabled people and 502 line managers to try and find out what exactly is being happening to disabled people in the labour market. And what we found was that COVID-19, unsurprisingly, had a real negative impact on disabled people's employment, with 71% of disabled people having their work impacted for the pandemic, and that rose up to 84% for young people aged 18 to 24. So what do you mean by impacted? Well, firstly, almost a quarter of people had been working reduced hours. Again, almost a quarter of people being placed on furlough. 20% of people lost out on income. There's a real sense of people feeling very insecure in their jobs because they feel that they're more at risk of redundancy. And at that time when we did this research, over a quarter of people still hadn't returned from furlough. And at that point in the UK lockdown cycle is when things had opened up temporarily before we went into chaos in late autumn, winter time. And as we said, young people are more likely to have worked reduced hours and lost out on income, will be made redundant than any other age group. Now, I won't go into too much detail on the slide because I'm conscious of time, but I just wanted to talk to you about Emma's experience. And Emma's my badly placed photo in the corner there. So Emma, she featured in our report where we published this research called Locked Out the Labour Market. And she was telling us about her experience of finding work. She has cerebral palsy and travelling on public transport is really difficult. So she wanted to work at home, and she'd applied to over 20 different employers who didn't offer a home working option. She needs flexible start times to work, and that wasn't being offered to her. So she had been unable to take up work. And in addition to the transport barriers before COVID, obviously she was high risk from COVID-19, so she really did need to work at home. And even though for many people these flexibilities have been offered, like I'm working from my flat today, this is not a universal offer to everybody. And just those flexibilities would enable Emma to take up a job that she's able to do safely in her home. And I did say I'd talk about employers as well. And hopefully everybody that's attending today's session, you know, really wants to employ disabled people, already doing it brilliantly in their organisations. But that, unfortunately, from our research, is not a uniform experience across all employers. So we've asked these questions for a number of years now. And obviously this survey from last year was a very specific, we had some specific questions in COVID-19. But we've asked about whether employers want to employ disabled people, and what we found out this year was that 20% of employers stated that they were still hesitant to employ a disabled person. Now that has gone down from recent years slightly, but it's still quite concerning that a fifth of employers are hesitant to employ a disabled person. And what we wanted to know why, and the biggest stat that came back is that 40% of employers said that it's because they perceive the work to be too manual or physically demanding for someone to do. So again, that's a misconception there around capabilities of individuals, and those perceptions really do need to be challenged. But on the flip side as well, research showed what more government needs to do to support employers to employ disabled people. There are concerns around employers making their workplaces COVID safe, with 42% of employers saying that's a barrier to them employing disabled people. And I think certainly from what we've been told from the people we work with, the workplace guidance is a little bit ambiguous and isn't very clear. So, you know, that's a real barrier. And then the following barriers are what comes up every year when we ask the survey around a key barrier being the practicalities of making workplace adjustments and the cost of making workplace adjustments. Now, the UK government has in place a scheme called Access to Work, which should tackle both of those issues. But as over half of employers cite these costs and barriers to making adjustments as a real issue, it shows that Access to Work scheme isn't reaching everyone it needs to make sure that disabled employers get the support they need to stay in work. And there's another issue about application processes not being made accessible. And again, our employment advisors had told us around how, even though it's a law for your application process to be accessible, when people were asking for adjustments, they were basically screened out of the process just because of the whole volume of jobs, applicants for jobs in the pandemic. So there's some real issues that need to be tackled there. And I think for us, one of the most worrying statistics is that we ask, in the last 18 months, have you recruited a disabled person? So when we did a survey in 2018, half of employees said yes, they had. But this decreased to 33%, just a third of employers in 2020. And as that's over an 18-month period, that isn't just because of the pandemic. So there's something a little bit more worrying going on there. But although it's a little bit bleak, I want to focus on some positives and the solutions. So what do we think needs to happen? Well, firstly, the government released a plan for jobs last summer outlining how it's going to get people back to work. It didn't include disabled people. So what we want is a specific plan for jobs for disabled people, outlining specialist support for individuals to get jobs, whether that's an employment programme or some form of jobs guarantee scheme where people get offered paid work as a foot in the door back to employment. We also think the schemes that are there need to be made disability inclusive if we're really going to build back better. So we know that Kickstart, which is aimed at young disabled people aged 18 to 24 to give them paid work experience, great idea in practice, but many young disabled people can't access it because you only can access it if you claim a certain benefit, and if you can access it, then there's adjustments like Access to Work aren't getting to people quick enough. So we think that needs addressing. We also are conscious that employers need more support as well. So we want Access to Work invested in so that more people can access the support from Access to Work and more employers can access that support as well. And we want things called what we're calling purple passports or adjustment passports. So a lot of big employers, so for example, BT uses anyway, where you talk about what adjustments you need at work, and that follows you throughout your career, whether you're progressing in the same employer or changing employers. So you don't have to have that back to basics conversation every single time of, yes, I need this. The equipment, the support follows you wherever you go. So there's some of our key recommendations of what we want to see change so we can really build back better for disabled people. But it'd be good to hear a discussion about everyone else's thoughts about how we can make sure we're building a more inclusive society following the pandemic. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Unmute, Gemma.
Oh, Gemma, I'm doing it you. It must be our names. Anyway, sorry, guys. I was just saying there's so many people might be thinking they might be wanting to ask questions throughout this, because I know we're raising some really big topics here. Please feel free to put some questions into the chat box. If we don't get through to answering them by the end of the session, we will definitely come back to you with some answers or guidance after the event. So, but thanks, Gemma. I think it's really important that we now, we've heard about the global landscape, we've heard about what our plans are within the UK and what that looks like, but what does that actually mean for people, disabled people? So we've got Ian and Robin who have agreed to come and join us to talk through what are the challenges that they face during COVID-19 to continue working or looking for employment. So Ian, can I hand over to you, and could you just give us a bit of an overview from your personal experience?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. So far, it has all been very interesting. Well, I'm nearly 35. My background is IT and education, and that's where most of my sort of volunteer sort of stuff lies. I've been trying to find work since 2007. Obviously, that's well before the pandemic. And at an average, I've been applying for about 500 jobs a month, give or take. Usual. Anyway, so, but I haven't really been getting, like anybody else, even getting a reply out of these employers is like trying to pull teeth, quite frankly. I would say that last month I checked my dashboard, as it were. I would say I had about 10% even reply to me, let alone tell me, sorry, I haven't got the job, whatever. And in that time, I've probably had about, in sort of the last year or two, I've had about 5 interviews. That's it. And of those 5 interviews, 2 felt like they were just going through the motions, literally just going through the motions. I would turn up, I would be in my best suit, do all the things that you normally do for an interview, prepare well, research the company, etc., etc., etc. And you did find that no matter what you did, it wouldn't be enough. So that was quite demoralizing. I noticed a direct difference when my disability was on my CV versus when it wasn't. There was, in fact, I recall one week, my phone practically blew up with responses to jobs, and I was wondering what the bloody hell was going on, excuse the French. And I checked, and my CV hadn't got my disability on it, and so that was quite telling. Gemma mentioned access to work earlier. That brings me on to an interesting point. When it comes to excuses as to why we're not given the jobs, we're not given the fair crack of the whip. My personal favourite is, we can't accommodate you, the building's too old. Now, one of my great passions away from all this is steam railways, and a lot of them are charities, and they adapt railway carriages and so on so that they can take disabled visitors out on the train. And if they can do it on considerably less income, in fact, a lot of them have a lot less income than some of these big businesses, and then it doesn't sit right with me that these big businesses cannot at least try and do the same. In general, the attitudes definitely need an adjustment. Excuse me, just one second, small technical problem here. There we go. Yes, I have done superb work with a company called Even Break, who I will present the link to you later. And they have done sterling work with disabled people. Its founder, Jane Hatton, is a wheelchair user herself. And she's done a lot of work with big businesses, including the likes of ITV, among others, who basically they just want to make sure that when people apply for a job, it's not necessarily a question of putting a disability first or anything like that, because obviously we're all going to be treated the same, but it's just making sure that disabled people get the same chances of an interview as everybody else. I think that the COVID pandemic, we need to almost turn it to our advantage in a weird way. We've all got our own unique skill sets and experiences, and the world needs to see what we can do. We need to place ourselves at the forefront of everything we do from now on, and we need to show that disabled people can contribute just as much, if not more, than everybody else can. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian, for sharing your experiences. Robin, can I hand over to you, because you're coming at it from a slightly different perspective because you are in employment.
Thanks, Gemma. Yeah, thanks, Gemma. So my story as a disabled job seeker in the pandemic consisted largely of frustration, boredom, and, as Ian said, kind of demoralizing repetitiveness. And I pretty much guess that was true for everyone, right? No matter whether you were disabled or not. But like, as a disabled person, yeah, as well as the kind of frustrations of general job hunting, you have to think about the impact of your disability on your chances. And with the things which Gemma and Stefan and Ian have talked about, it's clear to see that disability does have an impact, whether we like it or not, but also that the pandemic, for all for all the disasters it's brought, it has forced employers to learn certain lessons. We can all work from home. We can all work from home productively, more importantly. And it can no longer be used, that excuse can no longer be used in the future. So I think in some ways, as Ian said, we have to shout about the pandemic and the positive aspects it's brought to us, but also we have to remember that the pandemic is, like everything, positive and negative. And it's been mentioned about the bar being raised. And I think that's a very kind of good point to illustrate, because it kind of, as an 18-year-old disabled job seeker, although chances, you were still facing competition, it isn't as steep as it is now. With all that being said, so with all that being said, the issues which which are being talked about with the kind of Disability Pride Month and so on, and the work that Learn in Cheshire does, it's being brought ever more into attention. If you look at social media, if you look at Twitter, for example, there's a lot of advocates out there, and we all know loud voices get heard, right? And it's only a matter of time until those loud voices are no longer ignorable. So I think it's one for the future. Like, as moving forward, we all have to do our part, small or large, in shouting about disabled issues. But also remember that the pandemic has taught us a few things, and that productive working doesn't have to be the traditional route. No, like, we don't all have to go into the office 5 days a week. We don't all have to do 9 to 5, and that hopefully moving forward, employers in all our drive for normality, let's not forget, don't misplace all that knowledge which has been so hard gained and hard won this last year. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Robin. And I think you raised some really valuable points there. It's about having the conversation and raising awareness, and I think that's what we're doing today, and we continue to do from Leonard Cheshire. But also, I think what the pandemic has done is evidenced how quickly we can adapt and change. So where previously things would be quite slow moving to make adjustments, we can change pretty much overnight if we have to. So it's about that challenge as well, isn't it? Change can happen, and it doesn't have to take a long time to do. Anyway, thank you for all our speakers. Great topics. The links that have been mentioned are actually in the chat, but we will share them also with the recording after the event. I'd really like to move over to Roisin now, and just to talk about it from a corporate perspective, starting the conversation more widely. So Roisin, what do you think the labour market looks like now with the changes that COVID-19 brings?
Yeah, thanks, Gemma. I think the labour market in general, and it's so difficult to give an answer like this because we're talking about different industries. I'm an employment lawyer, primarily supporting businesses. And for some of my clients, it's been business as usual. You have to accept that a lot of the conversations that we're having today are about the opportunity that has arisen in office-based work, because we do have an opportunity, don't we? And things have changed significantly because every business has accepted that we can work from home and we can be incredibly effective and productive. There's other industries where manufacturing, for example, it's been business as usual. They've barely let up. People have had to physically continue to come to work. So in terms of the overall, what the labour market is, I would say my overall impression is that it's lean at the minute. Businesses across the board, some, as I say, some haven't been affected in a negative way necessarily by the pandemic, but certainly a lot of businesses I know of have had to make redundancies along the way, and there is just this impression of operating in a lean basis, so headcount has been reduced, and therefore, you know, it comes back to the point that Ian and Robin made about the competitiveness for those roles. But I do believe that more than ever, every business really needs to take a look at that education side for anyone involved in recruitment and managers and leaders generally, because there's so much scope now for prejudice to creep in. It should be best person for the job, but we need to be really mindful of the impact this is having on every individual who's applying for that job.
Yeah, thank you. Do you think that going forward, with more redundancies are going to happen once furlough ends in September, and we're going to go leaner? If we can get any leaner.
We're all gauging, you know, as employment lawyers, we can kind of gauge by the level of day-to-day advice that's coming in and the number of claims that are in the system. I certainly feel like a huge amount of redundancies have already been made, because we've seen that, because there's been a huge spike in claims as a result of that. Now, in terms of will there be more redundancies, we have to accept that if people have remained on furlough, hopefully a lot of those jobs will come back into play. I mean, the leisure industry at the minute is still tied up, you know, even though it's open some capacity. I know in the leisure industry there's some people still on furlough because they haven't been able to open to full capacity. So I think would be naive to say that there won't be any further redundancies, but hopefully there will be more jobs created in different industries. And then we go back to that kind of wider point, you know, which Stefan was touching on, is that it's the opportunity, you know, to open the landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I also wonder if there's a skills gap. Has that changed because of COVID? What, you know, are we looking at different skills for job seekers now than we were before?
Really difficult. I think certain industries, you know, there's certain industries where obviously have been hit so badly by the pandemic and they've shrunk, but certain industries have boomed, you know, so less so much of it is there a different skill set that we're looking at, but maybe in certain industries there's an increase in headcount. Skill set, you know, from a law firm's perspective, I couldn't say that as a law firm that we're looking for a different skill set necessarily, because the criteria is the criteria, but just basically on a basic recruitment perspective, we're all mindful, aren't we, that it's that actual, so remote interviews are still taking place, for example. So it's about less about the skills, more about what are we doing with our recruitment processes to make sure that everyone is getting the fairest of processes and the opportunity to come forward for these things. And I guess that has an impact on how you present yourself as an individual as well, you know, but it should make these things a little bit more accessible, I suppose, for those who physically have struggled to get to interviews in the past.
Yeah. I mean, Ian, have you, during the last 12 months, your interview process, have you seen that change at all?
Yes, I had one interview when it was on Zoom, but again, it very much felt like an interview I'd had previously. To be honest, it didn't physically change, but you can say physical change, but not an attitudinal change, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think maybe there are skills around, you know, the interview process, especially when it's done virtually, because there are some hidden cues that you get from a face-to-face interview, which can sometimes be lost behind a screen, and it's how we can pick up on those as interviewers to make sure we are selecting the right candidate for the job. But you've not really seen much change in.
If I could just add, though, I definitely, from what I've spoken, because I obviously spoke to several people who had interviews like this on preparation with this today, and they all said the same thing, that they felt very much more relaxed though about, you know, yes, okay, granted, they still have to, you know, turn up, you know, look presentable, all the rest of it, but they still felt much more relaxed in the sense that they're not having to go into the strange office and, you know, look around and see all these people look, you know, almost, I wouldn't say judging them, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I think one of the key skills that I'm adapting to is learning to take myself off mute at the right time. That's a key skill I think we've all encountered. So what are the changes that you've seen in the type of talent companies are looking for. Is that changing? Are we looking for a new type of person now? We've moved into a more virtual world, and is technology playing a larger part in our conversations when we're interviewing for candidates, which might have just been turning up to a traditional 9-to-5 office desk job?
Sorry, were you asking me?
Yeah, sorry, Roisin. Yeah, but guys, just to put it out there, if anyone wants to add to the conversation, please feel free to raise your hand if you've got something that you'd like to contribute. But yeah, sorry, Roisin, I was actually directing that one to you.
Just didn't want to jump in.
No, go, please go.
One observation I would make is, the jobs are still the jobs that we know that we need are still the jobs that we need, and you still need certain criteria to go ahead in certain industries. And I'm trying to be as general as I can here, but
yes,
one thing I would, and I think many businesses will agree with this, is we've just moved away all of a sudden from this notion that you have to be physically, within driving distance or commuting distance to a particular role. It's opened up geographically, certainly, and office-based work, has opened up geographically, and that'll be really interesting to see how the next couple of years pan out for that. And if it's open geographically, and we accept that the physical barrier to getting to an office, or even as you say, and getting to an interview, that for someone who has a disability, whether that is a physical one, mental, or both, the obstacles that they will face to get to the meeting, just to have an interview, never mind getting to the office, and what that might take from someone physically and mentally by the time they get there. So I think the talent pool ought to have widened, surely.
Yes, yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah, definitely widened. So that makes it more competitive.
More competitive, yeah.
Stefan.
Yes, thanks, Emma. No, a few things, two issues, in fact. Well, one on the skills. I mean, when we, in 2019, we launched a report looking at the future of work and how to make it more inclusive. And one of the conclusions was that skill needs become more complex. It's not just the technical skills which you need, but that you also need many other skills. The communication skills, they now need to be adjusted to this. Digital skills, I've spoken before about digital jobs, so people that are focusing on that, but at the same time, any job now needs to become much more digital. So people need to be fully familiar with the digital skills. And then, of course, there's this whole message that the current situation, or until recently, where you started a career, and when you started a career, it was more or less clear how you would progress. That is no longer the norm. And people will need to think about reskilling and upskilling and all that. And we need to think about what that means also for people with disabilities who are in the labor market, not just to make sure that they stay in the labor market, and not only that they stay, but that really flourish and go up in their career development. The second issue I want to address is a bit this situation with the private sector attitude. Because I was interested in the statistic that Gemma showed, which showed this decrease of employment in the private sector in the last 18 months. And probably it's mostly within the smaller and medium enterprises, who I think have suffered even more than the rest by the situation, and have then sort of reverted perhaps to a more conservative thinking on disability. And some of the prejudice and stigma that we thought we had overcome probably has come in again with the pandemic. What we have seen when the private sector with which we engage, which are usually large companies, very large companies, global companies, what we have seen is that after a couple of months where they were struggling to readjust, also in terms of how to make sure that their staff with disabilities that had now had to work from home, how to make sure that they would have the same adjustments that they would have in the office, to make sure that the communication platforms would be fully accessible depending on the different types of disability. After that time, the majority of them, of course, also depending on the impact or not of the pandemic on their accounts, we felt that there was a re-engagement, a reactivation of a recommitment to disability inclusion. In fact, in November 2020, we did our virtual conference of the ILO Global Business and Disability Network, and we issued a statement reaffirming commitment to disability inclusion in times of pandemic. Now, we really wanted to have the private sector say, disability inclusion is not something nice to have when everything is rosy. it is something that also needs to be part of our DNA and needs to be part of the exit from the strategy. And that goes back to the point about disability inclusion is not CSR. Of course, if companies look at disability inclusion as a thing that you do because you're nice and it's part of your CSR strategy, but then things go in the wrong direction. Companies that realize that people with disabilities bring talents and skills, that the diverse workforce is a benefit to the company, and the diversity includes other issues also, but also definitely disability. These are the companies that have even reaffirmed and have come even, I would say, come even stronger out of the crisis. I attended a meeting hosted. We had to launch a network of business and disability in Kenya, and it was hosted by the main employer federation but the equivalent of CBI in the UK in Kenya. And it was interesting to see the chair of that employer federation basically said something that I would not have expected, forgive my ignorance, from coming so strongly from an employee, which is the whole issue that we have seen that we need to focus more on persons than on profit. Of course, you need to have the profits to continue, but at the same time, there is a clear message that the pandemic has shown to some companies, and it will depend also on the leaders. Right? So I think the leadership is always a permanent issue, but the leaders will make often the difference in terms of how inclusive or not inclusive the exit is from the strategy. Huh? But many companies are strengthening even more now their commitment to diversity inclusion and seeing that also, I would even say, as a competitive advantage towards other companies. Also in the context, you see some of the statistics in the US where almost 1/3 of all employees, they want to change jobs. They want to find another. They realize that perhaps there are other priorities in life. And to some extent that probably, they will still need to find a job, they will still need an income. So perhaps they will be then looking for companies that have perhaps a more advanced thinking about these issues. So I think there are some silver linings, if I understand well that term in English, which I'm struggling with, but I think there are some opportunities also in the current context, as some of you were saying. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, 100% right. It's about talent, isn't it? It's not about your CSR and it's a nice to have. It's about making sure you've got the right talent. And if you look after your staff, which I think you were alluding to, that obviously you've got the right people doing the right jobs, that will then support your profit line anyway, because you've got the right people doing the right things to look after the right people. Robin, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, sure. So to your point, Gemma, about tech, and to your Stefan, I think it's massively going to be a game changer in moving forward, because in the work I do every day, and not just in work, but in my daily tech use as a blind person, tech plays a massive part, and I think it's a massive enabler because it's not relying on, well, if you do it right, it's not so much reliant on physical input, physical needs and stuff. So I think tech has the power to be a huge leveler. So I think moving forward, not just, for everybody, but especially for disabled people, tech is going to play a massive part.
Yeah, I agree. I think technology is going to be completely integrated. I think it's a combination now, isn't it? It's a blended approach to when we go back, but I think, yeah, it's going to play a huge part going forward and going to save businesses some money around not having to have maybe such large office buildings, because people can work from home in some sectors. That is, I'm not saying all jobs here, but some jobs do allow you to work from home, and that is obviously going to save businesses some money. Ian, you've got your hand up.
Yes, I was just going to add that I was part of a conference pre-pandemic, obviously, and one key thing that came out of that was that disabled people we all said that because we were almost, without reaching sound patronizing anyway, because we were almost more grateful that we were getting jobs, job opportunities, we were more likely to be more loyal to the company. And say, oh yeah, they've given us a chance, they've given us our shot, so we're more likely to stay there for say 5-6 years rather than moving on at the first opportunity, which I think a lot of sometimes with, particularly Robin, I don't know what Robin feels about this, but particularly with being some people that are sometimes perceived as being overqualified for the job that they want to do, and so therefore there can be sometimes that perception that whether you're able-bodied or not, will move on after, if you want a 15 grand salary and you could be getting 50 grand, sometimes people might think, oh, we'll just move on and we get 50 grand. And sometimes we just have to remind people it doesn't necessarily work that way. Sometimes all we want to do is just pay the bills and just move on. And I think that applies to the whole labour market, not just people with disability. But it was an interesting point that was raised.
Yeah, it's about security, isn't it? Once you're in your job, sometimes that security, especially now during the pandemic, I think people are thinking, I've still got my job. I want to stay where I am because I feel more secure than making the risk to leap. But yeah,
exactly.
Interesting point, Ian. Thank you. Robin, you've got your
raised. So just to add to Ian's point, it's one of, like, in terms of like grateful and loyalty, it's also true that like when a company makes the effort to provide you with accessibility accommodation, for example, I don't know, if somebody needed like a massive screen, like a massive monitor to do their work because they have low vision and stuff, and they provide that without any issues, and they keep providing you the things you need for work, then why would you want to leave?
Yeah. Looking after your staff again, isn't it? You get the right talent, you look after your staff, and then they'll be loyal and do a good job. Yeah, great point. Thank you. I'm conscious of time, but I do want to ask, and more widely to anyone really, how do you see companies going forward supporting a diverse and inclusive workforce post-COVID? What can we do as businesses to make sure we are being inclusive and diverse? Anyone want to?
I'll jump in if you
Thank you. Yes, brilliant. Thanks, Rasheen.
I think the pandemic's obviously shone a light on the difficulties that individuals face, people with disabilities. We know that it's disproportionately affected women as well, working women. So I think there's a lot of businesses that are already, pre-COVID, we're already on with accepting that we need to foster inclusive workforces anyway. There's so many benefits to come from this. Post-COVID, it's just even more important, I think, to get this right, to actually invest some time and resource into looking at equality and diversity in the workplace in general. And I think that it starts as I think it was Stefan that mentioned, it's leadership. It starts at the top. I think that, like, the leadership teams and management at all levels really should come on board on this project where we're all looking at fostering diverse workforces and addressing what problems have we got to accessibility for people from every background, and training. It's the education point. How can you as a manager support someone who in the workplace has a disability if you don't know what you're looking for as well, because it's that not everybody has the ability to speak up and just fully address what their needs are. But I think it comes down to leadership and management to understand how we can all get better at this and just educate. So many people, I don't believe people are inherently trying to ignore the issues, but we could all do with a lot more education on the point. And it's a simple thing in my view to do.
Yeah, 100%. It's that educational piece. You don't know what you don't know. So how do we educate and raise that awareness? I've got 3 hands up. I'm not sure who came first, but I'll go in the line in order of appearing on my screen. Stefan.
Yes, thank you for the good question. 2 things. First, we need to ensure that companies that can increase their commitment to diversity and inclusion put disabilities as a strong element there. It's still the poor relative in diversity and inclusion issues compared to gender, LGBTI, and race. No? All important issues, and intersectionality is there. No? But disability needs to be seen there. It's not acceptable that a company says, yeah, we push for D&I, but disability we don't do, or we don't do it this year. It's for next year. No?
Oh yeah.
You do 1 year, you stop next year. The other issue is we need to distinguish between diversity, which is a fact, especially in the context of the UK, where you have, by definition, a very diverse population. Diversity will happen almost automatically. What is important is to make sure that everybody with a diverse background, including disability, brings their full self, really is able to flourish. And I think it's the inclusion part that we need to make sure that companies need to do better. I think there's still a knowledge gap, which also we are just about to launch a survey among companies worldwide to look at the understanding of D&I and what companies, because I think there's still very often companies are still struggling with what exactly do we need to do to ensure that not only are we diverse, but we're also inclusive in our functioning?
Yeah. No, yeah, that's exactly right. Thank you, Stefan. Robin, you've got your hand up.
Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
No, you're unmuted. You're okay.
Yeah, so I think it's what moving forward, it has to be a holistic approach because everything's interconnected, right? And I think, especially with issues like disability and the others Stefan mentioned, is like it's all well and good having an accessible and inclusive application process, but what happens if you get the job and you can't do your work because you don't have the tools necessary, or indeed like if you do face any issues within work because of your disability, what if the environment isn't conducive to you raising those issues? So I think it has to be a holistic approach from application right down to day-to-day work and right down to raising issues with like managers and stuff.
Yeah, and embedded into the culture of the organization that actually this is, we talk about this, we're approachable and we can adapt and we can change to people's needs and requirements, as opposed to you're going to have to make a meeting to go and see somebody and there's a whole process and it feels like a bigger thing than it actually should be. No, yeah, I agree. Thank you. Ian.
Yes, I'm just going to feed into that actually. I think there's a lot of fear around on both sides of the fence, in spirit of honesty, about these conversations. And I don't think any disabled person on the planet, if a company approached us and said, they did all the right things and said, look guys, we're genuinely struggling with this. We can't employ you because of X reason or Y reason. And if somebody was being genuinely honest and said, look, this is a problem, and I don't think anybody would have a problem with that. But equally, I think we have a responsibility on our side of the fence to say, if a company approaches and says, what can we do? We can't just say, oh, you need to do this, you need to do that, and be black and white about it. We also need to be adaptive in the same way they need to be adaptive. I'd also argue that things like holding business meetings, not in the middle of in the middle of nowhere doesn't help matters. I mean, if I wanted, say we were holding a meeting in Cheshire and you decided that you wanted to hold it in the back end and beyond, it would obviously be very difficult for me to get there. Whereas if you held it in the middle of, say, a big city like Birmingham or Manchester, then obviously, that's more practical. I think we also just need to be mindful of the practical considerations as well when we're planning things there.
I think also, yeah, I agree. And I think the conversation has to be more wider. So it's not a conversation around disability, but it's actually, we ask all our staff, what do you need? How can we support you to be able to do your job in the best way possible? And that can be flexible working hours. That can be having a blended approach to being in the office a couple of days and being at home a couple of days. So I think it's around how we talk about it and that culture piece of we support and look after us, a bit what Stefan was saying, we look after our staff, and then if you're treating your staff well, then hopefully that supports the bottom line, and then you're profitable. And it's like that. Guys, I'm very conscious we've run out of time. It's 1 o'clock. Can I thank all our speakers for today? I think we could continue this conversation on a lot longer. We will be sharing the recording to, it'll be on the Leonard Cheshire website and it'll be on Pro Manchester website. If there's any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, to any of us. Sean will be sharing the details, but thank you for joining us for this conversation at lunchtime today. Sean, is there anything else?
Yeah, huge thank you. Just to reiterate really what Gemma said, just a huge thank you to all of our speakers today, and a huge thank you to Gemma for all of her amazing efforts hosting this session, and to Leonard Cheshire for all of their hard work getting this event off the ground, and a huge thank you to all of you for attending. As Gemma said, I'll send out a post-event email a little later today once I've got the video uploaded, and yeah, I'll give you everyone's details so you can continue the conversation, ask questions, and I can make any introductions as well. So yeah, other than that, thank you very much everyone, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks guys, bye.
Thank you, bye.